echoes of the moor. I was in a quiet, remote part of Scotland, far from the hustle of Edinburgh. The moor was dense and wild, offering a stark contrast to the cityscape I was accustomed to. I had come to find peace, to escape the world. My name is Alistair, and I was a city dweller, longing for the tranquility of nature. But what I found was something that would haunt my dreams for years to come. It had started off as a typical autumn day. The sky was a pleasant mix of cobalt blue, streaked with wisps of white clouds. A gentle breeze rustled through the heath, promising a serene day ahead. A stark contrast to the warning that the innkeeper, an old Scotsman, had given me about an incoming storm. I shrugged it off, considering it mere local superstition. The calmness was intoxicating. Not a single soul in sight, just the untouched expanse of the Scottish moor and the occasional wildlife. About a mile into my walk, I noticed a peculiar mound amongst the heather, a dark shape, eerily out of place in the natural palette of the moor. Squinting, I realized it was a body. The sight filled me with a mix of dread and curiosity. My heart pounded in my chest. The solitude that once felt comforting now felt isolating. Instinctively, I looked around for any signs of danger, for any hint of the perpetrator. But it was just me, the moor, and the body. As I neared the figure, the smell hit me. The scent of decay was overwhelming. It was a woman. Her clothes were tattered, her skin pale and bloated from days in the damp weather. She was face down in the mud, her blonde hair matted with grime and leaves. It was a gruesome sight, one that made my stomach churn. The reality of the situation dawned on me. It would take hours to get back to the inn and alert the authorities. The storm the innkeeper had warned me about was gathering in the distance, threatening to sweep the moor. The body had to be secured, or it risked being lost to the storm and the wild. I hesitated, fear and repulsion wrestling within me. The wind howled, echoing my internal turmoil, yet I couldn't leave her there, abandoned to the elements. I had to do something. With a deep breath, I braced myself and approached the woman. Her clothes felt cold and damp, the fabric sticking to my fingers as I pulled her out of the mud. She was heavier than I expected. I dragged her to a more elevated part of the moor, away from the worst of the incoming storm. Each movement released a new wave of the putrid smell, making me gag. I pressed my sleeve against my nose, but it barely helped. My hands were smeared with muck and decay, but I pushed past the revulsion. I couldn't let her remain lost and unidentified. As I moved the woman, I noticed her jacket was adorned with a unique brooch, a silver thistle, possibly an emblem or a memento. I decided to take it with me to give to the authorities. The brooch could serve as a vital piece of evidence for identification. It felt morbid, but necessary. With the woman now as secure as possible against the onslaught of the storm, I stood up, my heart pounding in my chest. My every instinct screamed at me to flee, to distance myself from the gruesome sight and the unknown danger. But there was still one thing left to do. I noticed a discoloration in the heather a few feet away. On closer inspection, my heart dropped. A severed arm lay a few feet away, half submerged in a boggy pool. The sight was horrifyingly grotesque, and I nearly lost my breakfast right there. But I knew what had to be done. I forced myself to approach the severed limb, fighting the urge to retch with each step. The arm was in a worse state than the body, grey and bloated, obviously the feast of various critters. I wrapped my hand around it, the flesh yielding in an unsettling way. With a gag, I dragged it to the rest of the body. The storm was fast approaching now, and the previously calm moor had turned into a hostile environment. I needed to leave if I was to make it back to the inn in one piece, but there was still the matter of keeping the body from being swept away. Using my pocket knife, I dug into the sodden ground, creating shallow trenches around the woman and her severed arm. I filled them with stones to weigh her down, praying it would be enough to keep her from being lost to the storm. The storm was upon me, the rain coming down in sheets, soaking me to the bone. The howling wind and the torrential rain felt like a physical entity, adding to the eerie atmosphere. I had to leave now. I took one last look at the woman, the weight of the situation settling heavily upon me. She had been someone. She had a life, possibly people who cared for her. It didn't seem right to leave her here alone, but there was nothing more I could do. I whispered a quick prayer, hoping her soul would find peace. With the brooch safely tucked away in my pocket, I turned away from the grim scene. The wind buffeted against me as I started my trek back to the inn. The rain soaked through my clothes, but it was barely a discomfort compared to the dread that filled my heart. I had a long, arduous journey ahead, both physically and emotionally. By the time I reached the inn, I was soaked, chilled, and utterly exhausted. But the terror of my discovery was far from over. I had a duty to report, to make sure the woman was identified and got the closure she deserved. But for now, I had a more immediate concern: getting out of the storm and back to safety. With a final shudder, I pushed open the inn's door, leaving the storm and the horrors of the moor behind. Yet I knew that no amount of warmth or comfort could erase the chilling experience that had marked this day. As I hung up my wet coat and moved towards the phone to call the police, the weight of the brooch in my pocket felt like a constant reminder of the gruesome discovery and my ensuing ordeal. The storm outside raged on, a haunting symphony to the day's horrifying events. I knew I would never forget the sight of the woman on the moor, a memory forever etched in my mind. The harrowing tale of the Nairn Shore. My name is Jake, and I've got a tale for you that would make the bravest of souls shudder. A few years back, I found myself in one of the most isolated parts of Scotland. A quaint little fishing village named Nairn had called me there with promises of peace and tranquility. But the peace, it seems, was a lie. I had been staying in a rustic cabin nestled by the edge of the sea, far removed from the hubbub of city life. It was a cool autumn evening, the sky veiled in shades of purple and orange. Wisps of clouds roamed aimlessly, like spectral apparitions against the celestial backdrop. Walking down the rocky beach, the crunch of pebbles beneath my boots echoed in the still air. The salty tang of the sea hung heavy as a lighthouse blinked intermittently in the distance, casting long, eerie shadows. A sense of unease washed over me, and the hairs at the back of my neck prickled as though some unseen eyes were watching me. Then I saw it. In the dim light, a formless shadow lay among the rocks, eerily still. A shiver trickled down my spine, and I felt my heart pounding in my chest like a drum echoing in the silence. As I approached the shadow, the crunch of my boots became louder, almost intrusive, breaking the rhythmic lullaby of the distant waves. The shadow took on a more definite shape. It was a body, a man, lying face down among the rocks. My breath hitching in my throat, my gaze locked onto the still figure. A voice in my head screamed to turn back, to leave the eerie figure alone and run back to the safety of the cabin. But I couldn't. I had to know. With a shaky hand, I reached out and touched the body. It was cold, colder than the evening air, colder than the seawater that lapped at the shore. I turned him over. The sight that met my eyes was something from a nightmare. His face was twisted into an expression of sheer terror, eyes wide open, staring into nothingness. His skin was bluish, almost transparent, stretched taut over his bony structure. His clothes were soaked, torn in several places, revealing flesh that was marred by unknown creatures of the sea. I stumbled back, the ghastly sight seared into my mind. I wanted to scream, to call for help, but my voice was stuck in my throat. The silence around me was deafening, punctuated only by the rhythmic thump of my heartbeat and the distant crash of waves against the rocky shore. There was something else, too, a low, barely discernible sound that seemed to grow louder with each passing second. A soft, almost melodic hum that seemed to emanate from the corpse itself. I bent closer, my ears straining to catch the source of the sound. Suddenly the body twitched. My heart stopped. I tried to move, to run, but my legs refused to obey. I could only stare as the body jerked violently, the humming growing louder, filling the air around me, making my head spin. Then, with a final violent convulsion, the body lay still. The humming stopped. All that was left was the crashing of the waves and the pounding in my chest. I looked down, my eyes wide with horror, at the lifeless body that had just moved. The twisted look of terror on the man's face seemed to have deepened, his open eyes reflecting my own fear. I had to get out of there. I had to tell someone. But as I turned to leave, a glint caught my eye. There was something clenched in the man's fist, something metallic, a key. With trembling hands, I pried it free. As I held the cold metal in my hands, I knew I was holding more than just a key. It was a link to the man's past, a key to the mystery that lay before me. I stuffed it into my pocket and raced back to the cabin, the horrifying image of the dead man forever imprinted in my mind. The storm's secret. The day I found the body at the beach started out like any other. I was vacationing in a remote part of New Zealand, far removed from the bustling cityscape of my home in Sydney. After having breakfast in the local cafe, I decided to take a walk down to the beach. The day was clear, the sun high, and a light breeze rustled the leaves, making the scenic walk even more enjoyable. The beach was as beautiful and untouched as one could imagine, far from the touristy beaches back home. It was just me, the ocean, and the occasional group of seals sunning themselves on the rocks. I found a perfect spot by a rock pool and was about to settle down when my eyes landed on something unusual. I squinted, trying to discern the shape amongst the rocks. It looked human, but I brushed it off as a seal at first. But as I moved closer, my heart began to pound with an eerie realization. It was a human body. Dressed in what seemed like a naval uniform, the body was lying face down in the water, limbs floating lazily in the rhythm of the gentle waves. My heart pounded against my ribs as I considered my options. I could turn and leave, make the long trek back to the town and inform the police. But the sky was darkening, a storm was brewing, and I knew I had to act fast. The stench hit me first, the smell of rotting flesh mixed with the saltiness of the sea. I suppressed the urge to vomit as I knelt down next to the body. The skin was bloated and the scalp was missing patches of hair. With a deep breath, I reached out and touched the damp fabric of the uniform, and a shiver ran down my spine. It was cold, slimy, and I had to muster all my will to not recoil. With a grunt, I started dragging the body towards the shore. The man was heavy, and the waterlogged clothes didn't help. As I pulled, the head rolled to one side, revealing a face that was no longer recognizable, and I had to stop myself from retching. As the first drops of rain began to fall, I noticed the man's leg, or rather, the absence of it. I looked back to see it floating a few meters away. My stomach churned at the sight, but I knew I had to retrieve it. The leg was just as repulsive up close, with the flesh in various stages of decay. The thunder cracked overhead, and the beach was momentarily lit up by a bolt of lightning. I knew I didn't have much time. I had to secure the body before the storm swept it away. I quickly searched the beach for something I could use to weigh down the body and found a few small stones. After wedging them around the corpse, I realized I needed something to bring back for identification. The pockets of the uniform were empty, devoid of any wallet or ID. I could only find a small metal object, tarnished by the seawater, with what looked like a faded insignia. Hoping it could be a clue, I stowed it away in my bag. Just as I finished, the storm hit in full force. The wind howled around me, lashing my face with rain and salty spray. The waves grew larger, threatening to reclaim the body. I cast one last look at the corpse, a strange mix of sorrow and fear churning inside me. This man had once been a living, breathing person. He deserved better than this. I whispered a silent promise to him that I would make sure he wasn't forgotten. I turned away from the body and started my ascent up the slope. The rain was pouring down, making the ground slippery. My heart pounded in my chest, not just from the physical exertion, but also the heavy weight of what I had just experienced. The wind howled in my ears, carrying the eerie sounds of the storm and the ocean, making the whole situation feel even more surreal and frightening. Finally, I reached the path leading back to the town. I took one last look at the beach, now barely visible through the curtain of rain. I knew the storm would erase any traces of the grisly discovery, washing it all away. But the memory of it would remain with me. It was a grim reminder that even the most beautiful places could hold dark secrets. I trudged back to the town, the metallic object heavy in my bag. My mind was a whirlwind of thoughts as I planned my next steps. The storm continued to rage around me, the lightning and thunder adding an eerie soundtrack to the horrifying discovery. As I walked, I felt a chill run down my spine. A sense of dread washed over me, but it wasn't just the rain or the cold. I couldn't shake off the feeling that something was watching me, that I wasn't alone. I quickened my pace, praying to reach the town before the feeling swallowed me whole. Echoes of the Forgotten Vale. The crunch of broken glass underfoot echoed in the empty alleyway. I stood there, my heart pounding, my mind grappling with what lay before me. The old derelict warehouse, a remnant from a more prosperous era of the city, was a hulking mass under the moonlight. It was a place avoided by locals and known only to a few adventurous teenagers and homeless drifters. And I, Alex, had found myself here on a cold winter's night in Chicago, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. I had decided to take a walk after a long day of work, a small escape from the monotonous 9-to-5 job. I had ended up in the forgotten part of town, where the only sounds were the distant hum of traffic and the occasional screech of a rat. I had never been to this part of town before, but my curiosity got the better of me, and I found myself drawn to the mysterious aura of the derelict warehouse. There, half hidden in the shadows, was a figure. It was slumped against the warehouse wall, unmoving. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The figure was human, but there was something unnatural about its posture, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I wanted to turn around, to escape the eerie quiet of the alleyway, but something propelled me forward. I moved closer, my footsteps resonating off the grimy brick walls. That's when I noticed the unnatural stillness of the figure. I reached out a trembling hand, my fingers brushing against the coarse fabric of a torn coat. It was a body. I recoiled, horror and revulsion coursing through me. The body was dressed in a ragged uniform, a once bright badge tarnished by time and neglect. It was a woman, her features frozen in a grotesque mask of terror. Her skin was mottled and bloated, a clear sign of decomposition. The sight was repulsive, but the thought of leaving her there abandoned was worse. The wind howled, slicing through the quiet night. The sharp, chilling gusts seemed to carry a warning, telling me to leave, to forget what I'd found. I looked around nervously, the feeling of being watched creeping up my spine. But I knew I couldn't just walk away. I moved the body, taking care not to look at the twisted face. The woman was heavier than she looked, her body unyielding against the cold, hard ground. As I moved her, I noticed a glint of metal near where she'd been lying. I picked it up, a tarnished ID card attached to a lanyard. The face on the card was barely recognizable, but it was a start. The wind whipped through the alley, carrying with it the whisper of an unseen threat. The darkness seemed to close in, the only source of light coming from the flickering street lamp at the end of the alley. I knew I needed to leave, to get to safety and alert the authorities, but as I turned to leave, a low, guttural growl filled the air. I froze. The sound was animalistic, filled with an unspoken threat. I could feel the presence of something in the darkness, something watching me, something dangerous. I could feel my pulse quickening, my breath hitching in my chest. I knew I needed to move, to run, but my body refused to respond. The growl echoed again, closer this time. I could hear the sound of claws scraping against the concrete and the rustling of fur against the trash strewn across the alley. My mind was screaming at me to move, to run, but my feet were rooted to the ground. Suddenly, a figure lunged from the shadows. It was massive, a hulking beast with glowing eyes and snarling jaws. I barely had time to react as it lunged at me, its claws slashing through the air. I dodged the initial strike by instinct, my heart pounding in my chest. The adrenaline surged through my veins, heightening my senses. I could smell the stench of the creature's rancid breath, a mix of decay and ferocity. Fear gripped me, but so did the determination to survive. I had stumbled into something beyond my comprehension, something lurking in the darkest corners of the city. I knew I had to fight back. Grabbing a broken plank of wood from the debris-strewn ground, I swung it with all my might, aiming for the creature's head. The wood connected with a sickening thud, but the beast didn't falter. It lunged again, its massive form overwhelming my senses. Panic surged through me as I desperately searched for an escape route. My eyes landed on a metal door, partially ajar, leading into the warehouse. With a surge of adrenaline, I darted towards it, narrowly evading another swipe of the creature's claws. The sound of my own ragged breath filled the air as I slammed the door shut behind me. Darkness enveloped me, broken only by slivers of moonlight that filtered through cracked windows. Every creak of the dilapidated floorboards echoed like a taunt. I knew I couldn't stay hidden forever. The creature was out there, relentless in its pursuit. I needed to find a way to defend myself, to unravel the mysteries that led me to this nightmare. As I cautiously ventured deeper into the warehouse, I stumbled upon a forgotten laboratory, complete with broken vials and shattered equipment. The air was heavy with a metallic tang, mingling with the scent of decay. I realized that this place held secrets that were better left undisturbed, but I had no choice. I needed answers, and this forsaken place seemed to hold them. I gathered makeshift weapons, a shattered glass shard and a rusty pipe as I ventured further into the depths of the abandoned laboratory. Whispers seemed to seep from the decaying walls, taunting and urging me forward. Shadows danced and writhed, playing tricks on my mind. The further I delved, the stronger the sense of foreboding became. Finally, I reached a hidden chamber, its entrance concealed by a crumbling brick wall. The room was adorned with macabre symbols and strange artifacts. It was a place of darkness and forbidden knowledge, a nexus where the horrors of the world converged. A single beam of moonlight pierced through a cracked ceiling, illuminating a book lying on a dusty pedestal. It seemed to call out to me, promising answers, but at what cost? With trepidation, I reached out and opened the ancient tome, its pages filled with cryptic symbols and incantations. As my eyes scanned the forbidden knowledge, I realized the truth. The creature I encountered was not of this world. It was an abomination, a result of forbidden experiments conducted within these very walls. Suddenly, a deafening roar shook the chamber, causing the ancient bricks to crumble around me. The creature had found its way inside, driven by a primeval instinct to protect the secrets within. There was no time to hesitate. Gripping the newfound knowledge tightly, I chanted the incantation etched on the pages, harnessing the dark forces that lay dormant in the room. Energy surged through me, intertwining with fear and desperation. As the creature lunged at me, I unleashed a surge of dark magic, engulfing it in a vortex of shadows. Its monstrous form thrashed and convulsed, its menacing growls silenced. In that moment, I had become a conduit for the forbidden, a force that had tipped the scales in my favor. Breathing heavily, I watched as the creature collapsed to the ground, its once terrifying presence reduced to a lifeless heap. The air crackled with residual energy, and the weight of what I had just witnessed settled upon me. Exhausted but victorious, I stumbled out of the chamber and made my way back through the labyrinthine corridors of the warehouse. The night seemed to stretch on, shadows whispering their secrets as I cautiously navigated the darkness. Finally, I emerged into the frigid night air, the abandoned alleyway now tinged with an eerie calmness. The moon hung high in the sky, casting a pale glow upon the scene of the encounter. I knew that the horrors I had faced would forever linger in my mind, a reminder of the thin veil that separates our world from the unknown. But I also understood the importance of burying this secret, for it was not a burden meant to be shared. As I made my way back to the bustling city streets, I felt a mix of relief and apprehension. The events of that night would remain etched in my memory, a tale whispered only to the bravest souls. The warehouse would continue to stand, its secrets locked away, waiting for another unsuspecting soul to stumble upon its hidden horrors. And so, as I walked away from that forgotten part of town, I couldn't help but wonder if there were other dark secrets lurking in the shadows, waiting to be discovered by those who dared to delve into the unknown.